The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon when the sun hung like a branding iron against the Colorado sky. Margaret Caldwell set down her coffee cup with a trembling hand, the porcelain clicking against the wooden table on her front porch. 8 years of solitude had taught her to read the signs of approaching trouble, and 12 riders meant more than a social call in country where neighbors lived 20 miles apart. She rose from her rocking chair, her calloused fingers smoothing the faded blue dress that had seen too many seasons of mourning. The ranch stretched out before her like a monument to better days. Corrals that once held prize cattle now stood empty, their weathered posts leaning like old men against the wind. The barn where Thomas used to work late into the night repairing harnesses and planning next season's breeding had become a tomb of rusted tools and broken dreams. The riders drew closer, their horses kicking up red dust that caught the afternoon light. Margaret's eyes, still sharp despite her 42 years, picked out details that made her stomach tighten. These weren't drifters or cattle buyers. Their horses were too good, their saddles too expensive, their riding formation too disciplined. They rode like men who'd learned to move together, to watch each other's backs, to strike fast and hard when the moment came. She stepped back into the house, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor she'd scrubbed 1,000 times in the years since Thomas died. The Winchester rifle hung above the mantelpiece, loaded and ready, the way her husband had taught her during their brief, happy marriage. Her fingers traced the carved stock, remembering his hands guiding hers to the trigger, his voice patient and kind as he taught her to shoot straight and true. "A woman alone needs to be her own protection," he'd said, his breath warm against her ear. "Promise me you'll never hesitate if the time comes." She'd promised, and Thomas had died 3 days later when his horse threw him into the rocks near Devil's Canyon. The irony wasn't lost on her. All his preparations for external dangers, and death had come from a spooked gelding and bad luck. The riders were close enough now that she could see their faces beneath their hat brims. Hard men with sun-weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much. The leader rode a magnificent black stallion, his silver spurs catching the sunlight with each step. He was tall and lean, with a carefully groomed mustache, and the kind of confidence that came from years of having other men follow his orders. Margaret lifted the rifle from its hooks, checking the action with practiced movements. The familiar weight of the weapon steadied her nerves. She'd used it twice in 8 years, once to put down a rabid coyote, once to scare off claim jumpers who thought a widow's land was easy pickings. Both times she'd held steady and done what needed doing. The riders reined in their horses 50 yards from the house, raising their hands in a gesture of peace that fooled no one. The leader dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground with the soft thud of expensive leather. He removed his hat, revealing silver-streaked hair that spoke of a man in his 50s who'd earned his gray through hard living rather than easy years. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We're looking for Thomas Caldwell. We've got business with him." Margaret stepped back onto the porch, the rifle held across her chest in a position that was defensive but not overtly threatening. "Thomas Caldwell's been dead 8 years come October," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "State your business or move on." The leader's expression didn't change, but she caught the quick glance he shared with a younger man who sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. The younger man had pale blue eyes and the kind of smile that probably charmed saloon girls from Denver to Santa Fe. But Margaret had learned to read the dangerous currents that ran beneath charming surfaces. "Dead, you say?" The leader's voice carried a note of skepticism. "That's curious, considering Thomas Caldwell sent us a letter just 3 months ago." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She gripped the rifle tighter, her knuckles white against the dark wood. "That's impossible. My husband died in 1878. You're either mistaken or lying." The leader reached slowly into his saddlebags, his movements deliberate and careful. He withdrew a folded paper, yellowed with age, but still intact. "This letter, ma'am, postmarked from Cedar Ridge, just 20 miles south of here. Signed with Thomas Caldwell's name and bearing his personal seal." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Thomas' seal, a distinctive mark, had carved himself, featuring the intertwined initials TC surrounded by a circle of wheat stalks. She'd seen that seal on dozens of documents, on letters to cattle buyers, on their marriage certificate. No one else knew about it, and Thomas had kept the seal ring with him always. "Show me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The leader approached slowly, his hands visible and empty except for the letter. He stopped at the base of the porch steps, close enough that she could see the weathered lines around his eyes and smell the leather and tobacco scent that clung to his clothes. Margaret descended 3 steps, keeping the rifle ready, and took the letter with one hand. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas, the same careful script that had written love letters during their courtship, the same distinctive flourishes that had marked their wedding vows. But more than that, the letter contained details that only Thomas could have known. References to their private conversations, mentions of hiding places on the ranch that she'd never told another soul, and at the bottom, pressed into the wax, his personal seal. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. The leader's smile was cold as winter wind. "Like I said, ma'am, Thomas Caldwell sent it to us, along with a map to a certain cache of gold he promised to share, provided we helped him with a little problem he was having. Seems he's been living under a different name these past 8 years, and he's ready to come home." The letter fell from Margaret's numb fingers, fluttering to the porch boards like a dying bird. 8 years of grief, 8 years of mourning, 8 years of believing herself a widow, and now these men claimed her husband was alive, hiding somewhere under another name, planning to return for gold he'd never told her about. The younger man with the pale blue eyes urged his horse forward, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. "Problem is, ma'am, Thomas seems to have gotten cold feet. Hasn't shown up for our arranged meeting, and we've ridden a long way based on his promises. We're hoping you might have some idea where he's gotten to." Margaret's mind raced, trying to process the impossible. If Thomas was alive, why hadn't he contacted her? Why let her believe he was dead? And what gold were they talking about? In all their years together, Thomas had never mentioned any hidden treasure, any secret cache of wealth that might explain why 12 armed men would ride across the territory seeking him. Unless everything she thought she knew about her husband was a lie. The leader picked up the fallen letter, brushing dust from its surface. "We're reasonable men, Mrs. Caldwell. We understand this might come as a shock, but we've got a legitimate business arrangement with your husband, and we intend to see it through. Whether that happens with his cooperation or without it is entirely up to him." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Margaret raised the rifle, her finger finding the trigger. "I've told you the truth. Thomas Caldwell is dead. I buried him myself in the cemetery outside Cedar Ridge. If someone's been using his name, they're not my husband." The leader's eyes hardened, and for a moment Margaret saw the killer that lurked beneath his civilized exterior. "Then you won't mind if we take a look around the ranch, will you? Just to satisfy ourselves that Thomas isn't hiding out here somewhere, waiting for us to give up and ride away." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the direction of the barn.
A 13th rider emerged from behind the building, leading a horse that made Margaret's heart stop. It was Thunderbolt, Thomas's prize stallion, the horse he'd been riding the day he died. The horse she'd sold to a rancher in Denver the year after the funeral, unable to bear the sight of the animal that had brought her husband home draped across its back. But this wasn't possible.
Thunderbolt would be 23 years old now, ancient for a horse, and this animal moved with the strength and grace of a mount in its prime. Yet the markings were identical. The white star on the forehead, the distinctive dark stripe down the left front leg, the small scar on the right shoulder from a barbed wire accident years ago. The 13th rider was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. He rode Thunderbolt with the easy familiarity of a man who'd been working with the horse for years, and when he spoke, his voice carried the soft drawl of someone raised in the deep South. "Found this fella in the back pasture," he said, patting Thunderbolt's neck. "Seems real attached to the place, almost like he knows his way around." Margaret's rifle wavered in her hands. Nothing made sense anymore. Thomas dead but writing letters, his seal intact, his horse alive and young when it should be old or dead, and now 12, no 13 armed men who claimed to have business with a ghost. The leader remounted his black stallion, his movements fluid and practiced. "Well, be making camp down by the creek, Mrs. Caldwell. Take some time to think about what we've told you. Maybe check through your husband's belongings, see if you can find any mention of the gold or the name he's been using. We're patient men, but our patience has limits." As the riders moved toward the creek, Margaret sank into her rocking chair, the rifle across her lap. The letter lay on the porch boards beside her, its impossible existence mocking 8 years of grief and the carefully constructed life she'd built around Thomas's memory. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her of the sunset on her wedding day. She and Thomas had stood on this same porch, watching the light fade and planning their future together. Had promised her they'd grow old here, that they'd raise children and build something lasting. Now she wondered if any of it had been real, or if she'd been living a lie from the very beginning. The creek ran silver in the moonlight, and Margaret could see the orange glow of the riders' campfire flickering through the cottonwood trees. She'd spent the afternoon going through Thomas's belongings, searching for anything that might explain the impossible letter or the mention of hidden gold. What she'd found had shaken her to her core. In a trunk beneath their bed, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind Thomas's winter clothes, she'd discovered a letter portfolio she'd never seen before. Inside were documents that painted a picture of a man she didn't recognize. Bank statements from institutions in Denver and San Francisco, property deeds for land in 3 different states, and most disturbing of all, a collection of letters written in Thomas's hand, but signed with different names. John Morrison, William Crawford, David Hutchinson.
The letter came with its own backstory, its own carefully constructed identity, and all of them seemed to be involved in various business ventures that had nothing to do with ranching. The letters spoke of investments, of opportunities, of men who owed favors and debts that needed collecting. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the portfolio's contents spread before her like pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls, and every creak of the old house made her jump. She'd loaded the shotgun and placed it within easy reach, though she wondered if 2 weapons would be enough against 13 men who rode like soldiers and had the look of killers. The letter from the rider's leader lay open beside the others, and she read it again, trying to find some flaw that would prove it was a forgery. But the handwriting was undeniably Thomas's, down to the way he crossed his T's and the distinctive loop he made in his capital G's. The seal at the bottom was perfect, pressed into red wax with the ring she'd seen on his finger every day of their marriage. "My dear associates," the letter began, "the time has come to conclude our business arrangement. The cash remains where we agreed, and my situation has evolved to the point where I can safely return to collect what is mine. Meet me at the old ranch on the 15th of next month. The woman there believes me dead, which has served our purposes well these past 8 years. She knows nothing of our affairs, and should not be harmed unless she interferes with our plans." Margaret's hands shook as she reached the final paragraph. "I have used the name Thomas Caldwell for the last time. When this business is concluded, I will resume my true identity and disappear as we planned. The gold will be divided according to our original agreement, and you will never see me again. Burn this letter after reading. T.C." The signature was followed by the pressed seal and a small map showing the location of what appeared to be a cave in the hills behind the ranch. Margaret knew those hills like the back of her hand. She'd ridden through them countless times during her marriage, and Thomas had claimed they were surveying for the best grazing land. Now she wondered if it'd been mapping hiding places for stolen gold. A soft knock at the door made her grab the shotgun and rise from the table. Through the lace curtains she could see a figure silhouetted against the porch light, the young man with the pale blue eyes who'd ridden with the group. He stood alone, his hands visible and empty, but Margaret knew that meant nothing. A man who could draw fast enough could kill her before she could bring the shotgun to bear. "Mrs. Caldwell," he called softly, "my name is James Mitchell. I'd like to talk to you, if you'll permit it." Margaret moved to the window, staying out of direct line of sight. "Say what you came to say from where you stand." "I can't do that, ma'am."
"What I have to tell you might save your life, but it's not something I can shout through a door." There was something in his voice, a quality of genuine concern that made her hesitate. She'd learned to read men during her years alone, and this one didn't sound like the others. His accent was different, too, not the hard-edged drawl of the leader, but something softer, more cultured. "Step back from the door," she said. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Margaret unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough to see him clearly. James Mitchell was younger than she'd thought, maybe 28 or 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that held more intelligence than she'd expect from a common outlaw. He wore good clothes, but they were travel-stained, and his boots were worn from hard riding. "Thank you," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I know this is difficult, but I need you to understand something. My name isn't James Mitchell, and I'm not one of Carver's men." "Carver?" "The man who claims to be your husband sent that letter. His real name is Samuel Carver, and he's wanted by the law in 4 states for robbery and murder. The gold he mentioned, it's not his. It was stolen from a bank in Denver 8 years ago, and 12 people died in that robbery." Margaret's grip tightened on the shotgun. "You're lying." "I wish I were." James reached slowly into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather folder. "I'm a Pinkerton detective, ma'am. I've been tracking Samuel Carver for 3 years, and this letter finally gave us the break we needed." He held out the folder, and Margaret could see the distinctive badge of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. It looked genuine, but she'd heard stories of men who forged credentials to gain trust before committing their crimes. "If you're a detective, where are the other lawmen? Why are you riding with criminals?" "Because Carver's smart and careful. He's never stayed in one place long enough for us to catch him, and he's never left enough evidence to build a case.
This letter is the first mistake he's made, and I've been undercover with this gang for 6 months trying to find him." Margaret studied his face, looking for signs of deception. "The other men don't know who you are?" "They think I'm Jake Morrison, a gun for hire from New Mexico. I've been careful to build that reputation, and it's kept me alive this long." "What about the horse, the one that looks like my husband's stallion?" James glanced toward the barn, where Thunderbolt was stabled for the night. "That's one of the things I came to warn you about. Carver's been planning this for months. He knew about your husband's horse, knew what it looked like, and he found a stallion with similar markings. The scars were added with a hot iron." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. The horse she'd thought was miraculously returned from the dead was just another part of an elaborate deception. Why? Why go to all this trouble? "Because Carver believes you know where the gold is hidden."
He thinks your husband, the real Thomas Caldwell, found the cash and moved it before he died. Carver's been looking for it for 8 years, and he's convinced that Thomas left some clue, some indication of where it might be. Margaret set the shotgun against the wall and sank into a chair. Thomas never mentioned any gold. He was a rancher, not a treasure hunter. I believe you, but Carver doesn't, and he's not going to leave until he's searched every inch of this ranch. Then let him search. When he finds nothing, he'll move on. James shook his head. You don't understand. Carver's killed 16 people that we know of, and he's not going to leave any witnesses. Once he's convinced the gold isn't here, he'll kill you and burn the ranch to cover his tracks. The words settled over Margaret like a shroud. She'd survived 8 years alone, built a life from the ashes of her marriage, and now it seemed destined to end in violence and fire. What do you want from me? Help me catch him. The letter mentions a meeting place, a cave in the hills behind your ranch. If we can get him there with the other men, I can signal my backup and we can end this. Backup? There's a full posse waiting in Cedar Ridge. When I give the signal, they'll come running. But I need Carver to believe that Thomas is still alive, that he's going to show up for the meeting with the gold. Margaret stood up, pacing to the window. Outside, the campfire still glowed through the trees, and she could hear the low murmur of voices carrying on the night wind. How do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know you're not just another member of the gang trying to trick me? James was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft and tired. Because I've been hunting Samuel Carver for 3 years, ever since he killed my brother in that Denver bank robbery. My brother was a guard, trying to protect the customers, and Carver shot him down in cold blood. I became a Pinkerton detective for one reason, to see that man hang for what he did. The pain in his voice was real, and Margaret found herself believing him. What do you need me to do? Tomorrow morning, tell Carver that you've been thinking about what he said. Tell him you found some of Thomas's papers, things that mention the gold and a meeting place. Make him believe that Thomas is still alive and that he's been hiding out somewhere, waiting for the right moment to come back. And then? Then we spring the trap. Carver will want to go to the meeting place, expecting to find Thomas with the gold. Instead, he'll find justice. Margaret looked out at the campfire again, thinking about the choices before her. She could refuse to help, but that would likely mean death for both of them. She could try to run, but 13 men on horseback would catch her before she reached the county line. Or she could trust this stranger, who claimed to be a detective, and help him catch the man who'd been using her dead husband's name. There's something else, James said quietly. Something about your husband that you need to know. Thomas Caldwell turned back to him, dreading what she might hear. Thomas Caldwell was a good man. I've read the reports from the investigation after his death. He was exactly who you thought he was, a rancher trying to build a life with his wife. He had nothing to do with the bank robbery or the stolen gold. Carver just chose to use his name because Thomas died at the right time, and because he left behind a widow who wouldn't ask too many questions. Relief flooded through Margaret, so powerful it made her knees weak. "Thank you for telling me that. He would have been proud of you, Mrs. Caldwell. The way you've kept this ranch running, the way you've survived on your own. Not many people have that kind of strength." For the first time in 8 years, Margaret felt a spark of something other than grief and loneliness. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. What time tomorrow? Sunrise. Tell Carver you want to show him something in the barn, some papers you found hidden in the hayloft. That'll get him away from the others for a few minutes, and I can brief you on the details without being overheard. James moved toward the door, then paused. "Mrs. Caldwell, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever you see or hear, remember that I'm on your side. Trust no one else but me." After he left, Margaret locked the door and returned to the kitchen table. The portfolio of documents seemed different now, less like evidence of her husband's betrayal, and more like props in an elaborate deception. She gathered them up and returned them to the trunk, then sat in the darkness, planning for what might be her last sunrise. Dawn came cold and gray, with a wind that carried the scent of rain from the mountains. Margaret had slept fitfully, waking at every sound, her hand never far from the shotgun. Now she stood at the kitchen window, watching the riders' camp come to life in the growing light. Smoke rose from their rekindled fire, and she could see men moving about, preparing for what they believed would be a day of reckoning. She'd spent the dark hours before dawn writing letters, one to her sister in Kansas City, one to the pastor in Cedar Ridge, and one to be delivered to the territorial marshal in case everything went wrong. The letters were sealed and hidden in the root cellar, along with Thomas's real papers and the few valuables she couldn't bear to lose. If she died today, at least someone would know the truth. The knock at the door came precisely at sunrise, and Margaret opened it to find James Mitchell standing on her porch, his face grim in the morning light. Behind him, still within earshot, stood the man who called himself the leader, Samuel Carver, the bank robber and murderer who'd been using her husband's name and reputation. "Mrs. Caldwell," Carver said, touching his hat brim with mock courtesy, "I trust you've had time to consider our conversation yesterday." Margaret nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "I found some things."
Papers hidden in the barn. I think you might be right about Thomas." Carver's eyes sharpened with interest. "What kind of papers?" "Letters, maps, things that don't make sense unless—" She let her voice trail off, as if the words were too difficult to speak. "Unless what, ma'am?" "Unless my husband has been alive all these years, just like you said." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but it had the desired effect. Carver exchanged a quick glance with James, and Margaret caught the almost imperceptible nod that passed between them. To anyone watching, it would look like confirmation of their story. Only she knew it was something else entirely. "Show me," Carver said. Margaret led them to the barn, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. The building was dim and dusty, filled with the scent of old hay and leather. Shafts of sunlight slanted through gaps in the boards, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift and dance with every movement. "Up there," she said, pointing to the hayloft. "There's a loose board behind the hay bales. I found papers wrapped in oilcloth." Carver studied the ladder leading to the loft, then turned to James. "Jake, go on up and take a look." James climbed the ladder with practiced ease, disappearing into the shadows above. Margaret could hear him moving around, shifting hay and pulling at boards. After a few minutes, he called down. "There's something here.
Looks like a hiding place, but it's empty now." "Empty?" Carver's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Afraid so. But there are marks in the wood, like something was stored here for a long time. And there's this." James climbed back down, carrying a small piece of paper. He handed it to Carver, who examined it with growing excitement. "It's a fragment of a map," Carver said. "Shows part of the hills behind the ranch. And look here, there's writing on the back." Margaret leaned forward, trying to see what James had planted for them to find. The writing was in Thomas's hand, or rather, in the careful forgery that James had apparently mastered during his months of preparation. "Meet me at the old place when the moon is dark," Carver read aloud. "Same arrangement as before. Tell the others to wait by the creek." The message was simple but effective. It suggested that Thomas was still alive, still planning to meet with the gang, and that he'd been using the barn as a drop point for communications. Margaret had to admire the detective's thoroughness. "When's the next new moon?" Carver asked. "Tonight," Margaret said. "Thomas always said the dark of the moon was the best time for private business." Carver folded the paper and tucked it into his vest pocket. "Then we'll be ready for him. Mrs. Caldwell, you've been very helpful. I'm sorry we had to deceive you about the nature of our business with your husband." "I understand," Margaret said, though the words felt like sawdust in her mouth. "I just want to know the truth. You'll have it soon enough."
As they left the barn, Margaret caught James's eye. He gave her the slightest nod, confirming that everything was proceeding according to plan. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand stayed close to his gun. Whatever was going to happen, it would be dangerous for both of them. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Margaret went through the motions of her normal routine, feeding the chickens and tending the garden. But her mind was focused on the hills behind the ranch where the final confrontation would take place. She'd ridden through those hills countless times, and she knew every trail, every hiding place, every approach to the cave that James had marked on his map. As evening approached, she watched the riders prepare for their expedition. They checked their weapons, saddled their horses, and made plans for what they clearly expected to be a successful conclusion to their long search. Margaret noticed that James stayed close to the group, playing his role as one of the gang, but she could see the coiled tension in his movements. Just before sunset, Carver approached the house one final time. "Mrs. Caldwell, I want to thank you for your cooperation. When this business is concluded, you'll never see us again." "What about Thomas?" she asked, maintaining the pretense to the end. "What about him? When you've settled your business, will he come back to me?" Carver's smile was cold and predatory. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, ma'am. Thomas has made other arrangements for his future." The words confirmed what Margaret had suspected. Even if Thomas were alive, Carver had no intention of letting him survive the night. The gold was only part of the plan. The real goal was to eliminate witnesses and loose ends, to ensure that no one could connect Samuel Carver to the crimes of the past 8 years. "I see," Margaret said quietly. "Don't look so disappointed. You've had 8 years to mourn him. Now you can get on with your life." After the riders left, Margaret sat on her porch and watched them disappear into the gathering darkness. The hills swallowed them like a mouth closing, and she was alone with her thoughts and the weight of what was to come. An hour later, she saddled her own horse and rode toward Cedar Ridge, following the back trails that would keep her away from the main group. James had given her specific instructions. When the shooting started, she was to signal the waiting posse with a mirror flash from a specific ridge. The men would come running, but they'd need to know exactly where to find the cave. The night was moonless, as dark as Thomas had always claimed was perfect for private business. Margaret reached her position just as the first gunshots echoed through the hills.
The sound was sharp and violent, shattering the peace of the Colorado night like breaking glass. She raised the mirror and caught the light of a distant campfire, sending 3 quick flashes toward Cedar Ridge.
Then she waited, listening to the battle raging in the darkness below. More gunshots, shouts, the sound of horses screaming in panic. James had been right. This was no simple arrest. It was a war. The posse arrived within minutes, 12 men with rifles and revolvers, led by a federal marshal who'd been tracking Carver for years. They moved down the hillside like avenging angels, surrounding the cave and cutting off any escape routes. The battle was brief but fierce. When the gun smoke cleared and the echoes faded, 7 of Carver's men lay dead. 3 had been wounded and captured, and 2 had escaped into the night. Samuel Carver himself was found with a bullet in his chest, alive but barely conscious. Margaret rode down to the cave as the survivors were being loaded into a wagon for transport to the territorial prison. James Mitchell, his real name was James Morrison, she learned, was sitting on a rock, binding a wound on his left arm. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over," he confirmed. "Carver's gonna live long enough to hang, and the stolen gold is back where it belongs." And Thomas? Thomas Caldwell was exactly who you thought he was, a good man who loved his wife and died too young. Carver never knew him, never met him, just used his name because it was convenient. Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a burden she'd carried for 8 years without even knowing it. What happens now? Now you go home and live your life. The real Thomas Caldwell would want that. And Thomas? Thomas Caldwell was exactly who you thought he was, a good man who loved his wife and died too young. Carver never knew him, never met him, just used his name because it was convenient. Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a burden she'd carried for 8 years without even knowing it. What happens now? Now you go home and live your life. The real Thomas Caldwell would want that. As the posse prepared to leave, taking their prisoners and evidence with them, Margaret stood in the darkness and said goodbye to the ghosts that had haunted her for 8 years. The lie was over. The truth was out. And for the first time since that terrible day when Thomas's horse had come home without his rider, she felt truly free. The ride back to the ranch was peaceful, and Margaret found herself thinking about the future instead of the past. There would be challenges ahead, there always were for a woman alone on the frontier. But she'd faced them before, and she'd survived. She was stronger now, wiser, and no longer defined by grief and loss. As she approached her house, she saw a light burning in the kitchen window. For a moment her heart skipped, imagining Thomas waiting for her with coffee and conversation. Then she realized it was just the lamp she'd left burning, a beacon to guide her home through the darkness. But it was enough. Home was enough. Truth was enough. And tomorrow, for the first time in 8 years, she would wake up as Margaret Caldwell, rancher and survivor, instead of Margaret Caldwell, grieving widow. The difference, she realized, was everything.